see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Cinnie Noble. Thanks, Cinnie, for joining me for this dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you, Edwin, and thank you for inviting me.
And so I want to give a little bit of a background about you. That just from your website, it says that you're a lawyer, mediator, conflict management consultant, and certified coach, and that you're the author of Conflict Management Coaching, the Synergy Model. And you have a website, which I'll actually show the web page right now. It's called, it's at synergycoaching.com. And so is there more you'd like to add? I know you do a variety of workshops and a lot of other activities. Perhaps you could give a bit more intro to what kind of work you're doing.
Sure. Having had a background in law and mediation, and I still do some mediation, I developed this model called the Synergy Model in '99. And so I spend part of my time coaching people on how to better manage conflict independently, so it's a one-on-one process. And I also train people around the world on how to use that model. And I blog and write and generally connect with people who are interested in, my motto is peace building one person at a time. And so it's generally trying to network with people about how we can bring peace in the world in the ways that we do in our different fields.
Well, I'm showing your Facebook page at the moment, and I'm seeing a picture, you know, your main picture there, and it's a beach with a whole bunch of these rock formations, as well as I also noticed it's the same on your web page and on your book. That what does that mean? The rocks piled on top of each other.
Well, the rocks that you see on the Facebook come from, I live a block away from the beach in Toronto on Lake Ontario. And every year there are people that come out and they build different sculptures. And one of the things that many do is build Inukshuks, which in Canada is from our First Nations folks building a homeward sign. And I have a huge attraction to stones. And in fact, I have a mural on my back fence that are stones. And so I'm very attracted to the whole idea of what stones mean. And one of the things which you see on the web page, I had friends that sent me a card, and that particular image is called Friendship. And that the person who does the sculpturing there has gone into a river in Ontario and has built this balanced art, incredible work. His name is John Soprano, and incredible work that's very spiritual. And so it touched me a lot, and that's why I've gone to use stones in many of the images I have about my work. It's solid, it's foundation, it's base, it's connection.
Yeah, I get that sense of connection with that one on your website, because you see they're all connecting in some way. And so I really feel that sense of connection. And so I guess that's what's important to you, is kind of creating that connection between people.
For sure.
Well, what we wanted to talk about is how do we build a culture of empathy? And I was wondering, you know, about your work, like what ideas do you have about that? But how do we create a culture of empathy? And you're kind of dealing with conflict, right? People are in conflict. And you're looking at bringing people together. And for me, that's all about empathy, is like bringing people together through kind of empathic connection. So how about for you?
Well, certainly in mediation, if the parties are open to how they can really look at what's happened for one another, which is what mediators try to do, is to help people look at stand in the other person's shoes, which is one of those oft times expression that's used. In coaching, someone is only coming on their own. And so without the other person there, it's building some internal compassion, empathy, that people usually need in order to be able to have a full picture. And so in the model of coaching that I use, I have what's called the not-so-merry-go-round of conflict, which helps people walk through the habits that they have when it comes to being provoked in conflict, and then to see if they can stand back and look at what might have happened for the other person. And that process brings huge empathy for people where they actually more methodically and not so much from an emotional place, but from a more reflective space, start to look at what did they observe and what happened for the other person. And that process, which I refer to as mutuality, is what starts to build a more empathic response to the other person.
So let me see if I'm getting this. It's like people are becoming aware of their own conflicts, or is it like they're in conflict with someone and they're trying to see what's happening inside of themselves in the conflict to have a sense of awareness?
Right. So the first step is about them gaining internal awareness about how the conflict affected them, where they went to, what assumptions they made, what values were happening for them, and then to take the same walk or ride on the merry-go-round to look at and what happened for the other person from what you saw. And so that's the piece. Before you can move ahead to that piece, it's important for people to build some awareness about their part of it, what happened for them, what it meant to them, why that was important for them, and then to be able to look at it from the other person's viewpoint to the extent that they are able to. And often if people aren't able to, it's because they really still need to talk about themselves a bit more and to get a perspective that it's very muddled in their mind, and conflict can create so much chaos in people's heads that part of what the coach's role is to deflect some of that chaos so that they look at things, have the chance certainly to express it emotionally, but then have a chance to look at it more reflectively. And then once they've looked at themselves closer, they're usually able to have a better look at what they observed in the other person in order to see if they can have a better sense of where their come from is.
So is it that you're acting, I mean, you're coming to a person who's in conflict, you're coming as a coach, and then you're kind of bringing your presence so that they can, and then you reflect back, you're kind of empathizing with them and kind of reflecting back to them, and then they're able to see more of their own struggles, their own kind of tapping more into them, what's going on inside themselves, because they're kind of seeing it reflected back from you. Am I getting that?
Not so much.
Okay.
I certainly will show lots of empathy for clients. I am, how can I say, I'm more inclined to have them self-empathize than have me do that. Not that I would ever not demonstrate that I'm caring and thinking and hearing them and listening closely. The process really is much more about building them to look at what happened for them in a way that they feel better about them. They have more insights, more awareness about what went on for them. Certainly I do empathize, but I don't spend a lot of time talking in that process. It's their process to get through. And so I'm more inclined to help them tap into their own insights and instincts and intuition than to give them mine. Along the way, though, the relationship between the client and coach is integral to their success. And so I'm always demonstrating and modeling that I'm caring to hear about what's happened for them. I do not show bias for the other person. I'm impartial to some degree. In that way, I'm the champion of my client, but I'm also not agreeing the other person is an idiot or something of that nature. It's really an exploration where I'm supporting them go through all of that.
Oh, so is it like a questioning, a Socratic kind of a questioning approach, like, having people kind of ask questions about themselves and using that questioning as a way of digging deeper?
It's really, in coaching, one of the most valuable skills that I learned, and coaches usually learn, is how to ask possibility questions, powerful questions, responsive ones that help people dig deep, the kinds of questions they may not normally ask themselves. So the coach's role is to ask questions for people to ponder and to think about and to think differently about their situations, which usually helps them reappraise it and reframe it if they're able to look at it differently. So huge skill is learned through coaching about doing that. And the program that I have on conflict management coaching, that's one of the big skills that I focus on with people, learning how to ask the questions and help people just go a bit different, look at things a bit differently.
So the individual, they're kind of doing almost like a self-empathy, a self-exploration. I mean, you hear of self-empathy. I don't know if that's a word that you use, but sometimes it's meant for kind of connecting to yourself, what's going on inside yourself, and you're using kind of an inquiry approach to inquiring into what's going on.
I would say that's really true. I think part of what happens, Edwin, is that the show of compassion and empathy that comes from the coach about people's journey, because often in conflict, people start to identify their contribution. And they might have some self-blame and self-criticism about that. And the role of coach is to help them identify it without laying blame. So the fact that somebody would even start to say, you know what, I ought not to have done that, and they recognize that, it's not for the coach to say, you're right, you shouldn't have. It's really, we don't use the should word. It's really around helping people make their discoveries without judgment. And that demonstrates a lot of empathy, and they start to feel better that somebody is giving them the space and the time and the energy and the compassion to listen and not lay blame as they go through their own exploration.
Yeah, so the judgment of others and self-judgment is often a way of inhibiting empathy. So you're trying to get away from the judgment.
Absolutely.
And, how do you get past the judgments? Like it's not like don't judge, It's like you can't just tell people don't judge, because that's only going to make them more tense, right? It's like some way you got to get past that.
Yeah. So in coaching, you don't tell people what to do anyway. So part of the process is what I refer to as the merry-go-round, is that when people get to reflect and then to break down what they saw happen in tiny pieces. So the merry-go-round is like the different animals on the merry-go-round. I don't use the animals as the analogy, but I use that there are all these different parts of what happens on a merry-go-round. So let's break it down. And by deconstructing it in using the reflective parts of their brain and not their emotional parts, people start to stand back. And that's where they start to lose judgment, where their judgment that they have made about the other person. And they've also, by that time, when we've explored it for them, have started to reduce their own self-criticism and self-judgment through the help of the coach supporting them through their discovery.
Okay, so it's by you're seeing your life, your internal life as a merry-go-round. There's all these emotions and things kind of swirling around, and you're saying, okay, let's just look at the horse on the merry-go-round. Let's just look at the head of the horse, or maybe just look at the eye of the horse, and let's kind of look and explore that. And then it kind of like you go into an exploration, and so it's the exploration of it as well as kind of a supportive coach there that's kind of reducing the judgments around it.
The elements of the merry-go-round start with the person looking at what specifically it was that provoked them and triggered them. So many people don't know. They have a general view about this person just, made me so angry when, and then they have trouble with what specifically was it. And then another element would be, and what's underneath that? What values are at work? What did you need? What aspect of your identity is being undermined? What's the impact? Well, what kinds of assumptions did you make? So all of those are elements. What went too far? When did it cross the line for you that the person had really, pushed the envelope? What was your external reaction? What are the consequences? Those elements are explored for the person based on what initially provoked them. And then you take that merry-go-round, you say, so let's look at the same horse from the other person. If you're going to use the metaphor, you would do the same thing, but it's the same elements. And the elements outline the habits that most people have, the patterns. So when we get provoked by any of us we often go through this range of thinking that happens. And what I've just described to you is a common thread that happens with many people. I did research on what happens once we're provoked. And I heard that people follow the pattern that I told you about just now. And that pattern, that thread, when people start to dissect it and look at it closer, to me, it deconstructs it before they're able to reconstruct what to do next, helps build up a better understanding about what happened for them and then what happened for the other person.
So you get this deeper insight, and do you bring the parties together, or is it the person is only kind of working it out on their own? In coaching it's one-to-one. So people come because they want to build their own capacity to handle a situation. There are situations when I'm a mediator where I might
I use coach-like principles and approaches to help people better prepare for mediation. But often people come to coaching because they're trying to build their conflict competence and their conflict intelligence and become better at doing what they're doing without it being about, let's bring in the other person. It's, can I do this on my own? So there are lots of people that have long-term relationships, whether it's in a family or managers, that don't really want to do issue by issue, let's deal with what's going on with this person. It's, if I could understand more what happens for me, and if I could analyze what I think happened with the other person, then maybe I can work on this together rather than bringing in a third party.
So it's a very, I mean, there's different approaches. So this is very much of a kind of a questioning analysis kind of a process. There's also, I mean, you're probably familiar with like Carl Rogers and his reflective listening approach. So it's like you're not asking any questions, you're not kind of analyzing, or it's just kind of keep reflecting back, which he's kind of calling empathy, right? It's just the kind of creating that synergy, that resonance between himself and the other person. So how do you see that kind of fitting in, that that type of empathy? You know what I'm saying?
Right. You know, I think clients feel quite empathized with when they know that they're being heard as a starting point. So, well, some coaches will use reflection and reframing and paraphrasing. I don't find I do that. I don't say very much in coaching. I show it, I hear it, I acknowledge it in other ways other than reflecting back what they have said to me. And you know, I might be more likely to say to a client, what is that meaning for you right now? Or what's your intuition telling you right now? Rather than me saying, this is what I'm hearing, this is what's going on. It's really very much self-determinative in the process that I use. But I'm not saying that reflecting back is a bad method. There's no right or wrong or good or bad. I think we just use different ways of letting people know that they're being heard.
Yeah, the reason I asked is I've been very interested in that reflective listening approach. I'm kind of exploring it. So I'm really trying to understand, you know, how these different processes interact. And so what I'm kind of hearing is you're kind of like a sounding board on your presence, and you're kind of offering questions for the person to do their exploration with, and that exploration will lead to some kind of an insight that will give them some sort of a transformative insight to change something within inside of themselves.
I think that more accurately would describe that. You know, sometimes the best amount of empathy you show is by the question you ask next, that you have heard and that you're taking them further along the journey. What I found in the model that I developed, that people very naturally go along these 7 stages when they tell their stories and when they try to make a plan about what to do. And so my role is to facilitate that journey. That's how I see it in the coaches that I train. It becomes a more hands-off, very much there with the client as they do it, go through their process, but not leading to where the coach thinks they need to go, but leading where the natural sequence goes about how people think and, you know, start to make a plan about what's different. So what I have found over time and in my research was that people could not, if they made solutions and decisions about what they were going to do without that exploration, they would have the same mindset and heart set and soul set that they did when they first came in. So unless they can look differently at what's going on for themselves and the other person and the situation, they'll do the same old, same old. So as they build more insights and awareness, then they're more likely to shift that. And where their ahas come and where they, you know, have the coach help them, it builds up the momentum where people start to feel better and recognized, and that they are moving ahead incrementally to where they need to be going or want to be going.
But you're kind of moving towards that aha, that moment of where there's a little bit of a transformation. It's like, oh, that's how it works. Maybe I can, and then out of that, maybe will come new options for them to try.
That's right.
Okay. So, and then it's a purely individual kind of a process in the sense, I mean, there's conflict approaches where then the person would go to the person they're in conflict with or whatever and have some kind of a interchange. But this coaching process is just the person has their aha, they've had some sort of a transformation, and then, you know, hopefully their life is, enriched somehow.
It's not, it's no, many people want to have a conversation with the other person. So it's not just that they've got more conflict competence by the end of it. They've got conflict and competence to move ahead with that particular person. So people come to coaching because they might have a dispute going on and they want to figure out what to do to handle it effectively. They might have had one and they want to go back and make amends or think it out or do something about it, or not. Or they want to, they anticipate there could be an issue and they want to be prepared for that. So it might be an announcement to a meeting, a team meeting where they know there's going to be pushback, or a performance appraisal, or a difficult conversation with a family member. It could be any number of things. People also come, though, because they may never want to have contact with the other person again, or they don't necessarily want to do that. They figure after many disputes and conflicts that they keep doing X. And they come because they say, I've got to stop doing this. I keep getting defensive, and then I get angry, and then I blow up. I've got to figure out how to nip this in the bud. And so that's more of the conflict intelligence piece, where people might come where they don't really want to go to the other person. They want to learn something so that they can handle lots of situations where those things happen. So dispute specific or more general?
Well, I start off the dialogues. I forgot to ask about your most important value. I find that who I'm talking to, I like to know what it is that is the most important value in their life. And so, switching gears a little bit, do you have something that a value that you think is kind of the one that's most important? And how did that become important to you?
Yeah, I have a lot of values that have to do with connection, as we already talked about. Giving back is a huge part of my sort of value system. Making things happen. Those part of what I learned at a fairly young age, and I suppose that's part of the history that you're asking about. How did that happen? I don't think I really knew this at the time, and it's only in retrospect and thinking about it that one of the first times that I knew or demonstrated empathy, I believe, came from being sort of parentified as a young child with poor parents who were working really, really hard all day at work. They ran a little store, and they were always exhausted. And one of the ways that I learned how to cope with that was to take care of them. And there would be one, that could backfire the situation. And in fact, in my own work around all of that, what I realized was that I came to feel for them. I had a sense that their days were long and busy and difficult, and they struggled and really wanted to have a life that they didn't have, which they succeeded at ultimately. But I think that my first sort of signs of that, if I look back, had to do with that. I had some fairly significant things happen, and one that occurred to me the other day when I knew we were having this conversation, Edwin, was about in the late 70s, I was working as a social worker in a hospital, and I was working with people with disabilities. And I used to travel a lot. I still do, but I was traveling a lot and noticed that I didn't see people with disabilities in my travels in various parts of the world. And I looked into, who is doing travel for people with disabilities. And at that time, there was an organization in the U.S., and I ultimately went on to start the first travel agency for people with disabilities. And when I was doing that, my first sort of site visit was in Hawaii, and that they were well known to have great accessibility. And this goes way back before the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the way that I figured out accessibility was to get a wheelchair. So there's lots of disabilities, but the physical disabilities were ones where people couldn't walk to get to places and get in airplanes and hotels, etc. And so I got a wheelchair and started to try to understand. But of course, I could get out of that chair at the end of the day, and I couldn't always manage it. And so I had people help me. And I met on the day 3 of a 5-day site visit to choose hotels and sites, etc., a gentleman in a wheelchair with his wife. And I arranged for them to go to these sites and got a sense of it. And I ended up becoming a very strong advocate for people with disabilities and really made things happen, which is where that goal was so important to me. How do you change that? And one day my cousin said to me, "How is it that you became such a strong advocate for people with disabilities?" And out of nowhere, I said, "I think I must have been disabled in the previous life." And we laughed about it, but we've remembered it because some of where I got to was pretty deep empathy for the struggles that people had. And of course, as I said, I could get away and get out of a wheelchair and not deal with that. But I had such a strong understanding around it by working with people with disabilities that I was able to become a spokesperson for those who couldn't. And that made things happen. That changed a lot. And I was very humbled by that experience. I also had lots of empathy that seemed to get demonstrated in all kinds of ways.
Well, yeah, the part about your parents, like I know I was growing up, my parents started a business, you know, of their own, and there was all these sacrifices. I had to work there. It was a miserable, you know, like, oh, at 11 years old, I'm working in the shop and have to do all this kind of stuff, and kind of hated it. And it sounded like for you, it was you were seeing their struggles more deeply. You know, it's like I had maybe more of a superficial. I was thinking about me and all my hardships and not being able to be out there and play. And you seem to have a deeper empathy for the struggles, feeling the struggles that your parents were having. So,
yeah, and I'm not quite sure where that came from, but I did.
Mm-hmm.
I did. But I don't think I knew it at the time because, in fact, I think that I had a sense of not getting attention and what I needed. But I also had a sense somewhere along the line that was tough. And I took on the, you know, in social work and law, I was always taking on the underdog's role. And so, you know, there must be something there, connection around that I really wasn't so conscious of, but it became a very strong part of me that might have been my role and my purpose here to help other people who couldn't speak for themselves.
So it's having a deep sense of connection is your role, and then it's like having that connection, really feeling what they're feeling, and then out of that sense of connection, wanting to contribute to their well-being, and something about really taking the action to, you know, do something about it, not just say, oh, too bad or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is something that I agree with what you're saying, and I better articulated than I could because it felt I just couldn't get my arms around it, and even thinking about this discussion about what really was it and how did that happen, and you know what was it that where I first acknowledged all that. It's pretty hard to point that figure.
Well, for me, it's like sometimes I'm always envious of people that have these inspiration stories. It's like they remember the moment. This is big. For me, everything kind of happens in these little bits and pieces. I'm not even sure where the change kind of happened. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So then that kind of led you then into even conflict, I guess, becoming a lawyer, and then are you doing coaching as well as one-on-one or group conflict coaching, or is that?
I don't do much group. I do one-to-one more, and in mediation still. A group has not ever been one of my favorite things to do. I like to work more individually in smaller groups. Part of that's because I'm pretty introverted too, so I think it's something like that. Although you don't know that when I run a workshop, that I think in terms of working with groups, it's there.
Okay, so you know, these dialogues are about how do we build a culture of empathy, and I'm just wondering, you know, what your thoughts are about that. Like sometimes it's a question of what is empathy even to begin with, and for me, I like to approach it, the definition, in terms of metaphors, because I feel it kind of integrates the intellect and the emotional part. So even the typical definition of empathy is standing in someone else's shoes, looking through their eyes, as we just like a metaphor. For me, empathy is like this cornucopia, because as I connect with others, you know, I'm kind of experiencing, they're experiencing, so it's this cornucopia of experience. And I was wondering if you have you know, your own personal metaphor of what empathy would be like to you.
Yeah, you know, it's such a great question, and I love metaphor questions. And at times it varies. And I've thought about this actually because in a lot of the work that I do, people talk in metaphors as well, and I've learned more to look at a metaphor. And to some degree, it might be sharing tears, two tears together, four footprints walking side by side. And interesting that I thought something that really touched me, that to me was really the sign of empathy. And so it's a pitcher of water. And I'm going to tell you the story behind that because it really touched me. And I did some work in Ireland a number of years ago, and some of the training happened at a center that's no longer there, but it was set up for kids, usually in high school, who were just on the border of going way off the rails. And they already had done some petty crimes and other types of things and showing some behavioral issues. And they had high number of staff per person. So a big place with lots of numbers of working with people. And I thought it was really terrific. And they really try to help people go through a lot of experiences in life that maybe they hadn't had. And I only in retrospect saw that one of them had to do with empathizing, that they came from pretty rough homes. They didn't, they probably didn't get a sense of being cared about themselves, and that maybe they hadn't really cried for themselves. And the person who was running a program there was a funeral for somebody that they all were close to. And in the chapel, the person put a pitcher of water with a basin. And he had everybody in a circle, and he had each of them come up and pour the pitcher into the basin and to say, who are they crying for? And I loved that. And what I loved about it was that people were crying for themselves. And not only their loss, but what they felt for themselves. And that self-compassion piece it just touched me. I mean, even tearing up talking about it. There was something about who are you crying for? And that if we, that the metaphor to me became the pitcher of water as I talked about it, and that it's allowing that time and space and energy to feel for yourself. And I think it's hard to be empathetic for someone else if you don't have self-empathy.
So the empathy is like a pitcher, or people getting together and saying that we're crying. Who are you crying for? I guess.
Yeah.
And it's that I can't. What?
And it's okay to cry for yourself. And, as I was thinking about this, it's so interesting, great coincidences. I saw this great quote. I'm just going to read it. You might have heard it before. And it was, it is possible to travel the whole world in search of one who is more worthy of compassion than oneself. No such person can be found. I love that. That to me is a starting point for empathy, is feeling for yourself.
Well, that's something that happens a lot. As people say, "Oh, to empathize, I have to sacrifice myself, or I don't deserve to be heard, or I'm not worthy, or something." And then there's a kind of a real, there's something about it, for me at least. If we're empathizing, it's really about holding both of our humanity together. So I have to be able to get in touch with my humanity as well as the other person, and for them to be able to see my humanity and theirs, and to kind of feel that merging of the humanities. And for me, that crying together is really everybody kind of synchronizing around that sense of we've all had tears, we all have pain, we all have this sense of loss, perhaps, or alienation, so.
Yeah, and that it's okay to cry for yourself, to identify what you feel sad for yourself. I think there's something pretty rich in that, that if people do that. And I find in coaching sometime that if I say to somebody, what if someone, especially if somebody's crying, but it may not, but if they are, who are you crying for right now? And if they say themselves, what are you crying for? People get to the nub of a lot of stuff that they feel that they're not getting or needing, and it might be from the other person. It could be deeper than that, but often what shows up in conflict are those grains of things that people need from somebody else. It might be I just want to be listened to. I just want to get heard. I just want to feel I'm important. And a lot of that trickles up in conflict conversations.
Yeah, it's kind of like somehow going inside of yourself and saying what your needs are, maybe. Like, what am I really needing? I'm really needing love. I'm really needing attention. And I'm needing a hug right now,
Yeah,
or kind of
that's
whatever it is. Yeah, to be able to have that. And that's kind of, it's something about that actually creates, I kind of use one metaphor is empathy is kind of like a mirror, you know, and what you're doing there is you're kind of cleaning your own internal mirror, right? It's like saying here,
right.
as well as kind of sharing that. It's like, oh, if I'm always looking out, then not looking in as well. There's something important about that.
Yeah, I agree.
So, well, in terms of creating a culture of empathy, I'm looking at empathy as like this foundational value that, you know, how do we create a culture that values empathy as maybe like a foundational cultural value? And how do we kind of nurture it and foster it? So I don't know how, if that even is a goal, if that's something that sounds like you know, a vision or a goal, and if it is or is not, you know, how do we go about creating that?
Yeah, I'm more inclined to look at that kind of question from a conflict management platform or lens, and about learning how to manage oneself in conflict at really young. And that probably is in the schools at least, and there certainly have been peer mediation programs. And I think it has more to do with how do you help people at a pretty young age start to get a sense of um, how can they understand their actions and look at accountabilities and consequences. And when conflict happens, what do you do? Many people learn how to avoid conflict pretty young as well. So it's how do you see it as an opportunity, and how do you look at experiences that seem really negative in a way that helps people better build empathy, even at really young age. And I was thinking the other day actually about when my nephew, who's now 12, when he was just 6, I had laryngitis when we spoke on a weekend, and he said, "What happened to you, Aunt Cinnie?" And I told him that I had a frog in my throat. He'd never heard that expression. I had a lot of laryngitis, and so we laughed about that. And as I try to laugh through my conversation when I could barely talk. And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I think I haven't been taking care of myself." And I heard the phone go on the table, and I heard him say to his mother, "Can Aunt Cinnie come here so we can take care of her?" He's only like 6.5 years old. And I thought, what was it that Adam had that how come he could empathize when lots of kids aren't going to be going there? And what I thought about was conversations I'd overheard in their household, and I've heard this sort of thing in my other nephew's household as well, which was about accepting and acknowledging feelings and thoughts, and that it was okay to be in a bad mood, and what did that mean, and talking about it and empathizing and acknowledging it at a pretty young age in his household. And that's pretty special, and lots of kids don't get that. And so even if you try what you can in schools, they still maybe have parents that aren't going to go there. So at which age and stage, can you help to instill more of those empathetic things? I don't know what that is, but to me, that's a starting point.
So starting in the schools, I mean, I know I've taken some conflict, mediation courses, just more recently. And I thought if I would have had those back in the schools, in my grammar school or junior high or even high school, it would have been very helpful for the rest of my life just to have had that. Because it sounds like what you're saying is one of the things was to find conflict, and how do you deal with conflict in kind of like an empathic way is part of it. It's like, conflict is part of our life, and we're going to need, strategies, approaches, skills, maybe even kind of the resilience to be able to deal with those conflicts, and start teaching that at an early age.
Well, and as I said earlier, since a lot of what I find at the adult level is building self-awareness, that how can you help that at a young age so that kids get to look at what they assume, so they only have their frame of reference about why Joey hit them outside in the schoolyard, but they may not know why Joey really did. They just assume, so they can have some little grains of that. So how can they learn to check out assumptions, to look at the wide range of possibilities? To me, that kind of training and understanding at a young age would be incredible to start to that. How do you stand in the other person's shoes, and how do you check out that kind of merry-go-round at a really young age, so that kids could even learn some of that language. And I've had some of the people I've trained working with young adults on this, and I think it could probably start at even a younger age to build that empathy.
Yeah, I saw, well, you're talking about conflict on your website, your book, everything has, the word conflict in it. So it's the central thing that you're kind of dealing with. And there's a quote that I really love. It's by Johann Galtung, who he started a lot of these this field of peace and conflict studies programs in the universities, as I understand. And he has a quote, and he says, peace is resolving conflict with empathy, nonviolence, creativity, and it's a never-ending process. Mm-hmm. So, and then on your site, I saw a list that says, you're talking about conflict, and it says, I can't what the intro to it was, but fleeing when in conflict, which is one thing we do to avoid the conflict, freezing when we're in conflict, which, we kind of shut down, fighting when we're in conflict, and feeling confused. And then you had another one, forgive and forget. So these were they seem like strategies which you feel are not good strategies, or...
So, that's part of the blog. And so the blog that happens every week is I raise an issue that's in conflict field, and then possibility questions to take a look at what they mean. So it's not, fleeing and freezing and fighting. Those are, we often call fight or flight. And there's also freeze. They're kind of brain things that happen for people when they're in conflict. And so it's really the questions ask people to look closer at, if that's what you do, how come, and to explore it. So they're meant to be some of those possibility questions that I referred to earlier about looking at what strategy, because sometimes it's appropriate to flee from conflict. So it's not like it's right or wrong. It's about, we all have different ways, and which ones serve you and which ones don't serve you, and under what circumstances. Mm.
So these were just meant as topics to start a self-exploration around.
Exactly.
And say, well, what is that? What do I do with conflict? Well, I tend to avoid conflict and leave conflict, or I tend to get into a fight in it. And what would be so with empathy, what is the empathic means of resolving conflict? If like Johann Galtung says, I would actually change his piece is resolving conflict with empathy. I would say a culture of empathy is resolving conflict with empathy and creativity, and it's a never-ending process. I'd kind of reframe that from my own uses. So, how do we then, use empathy within conflict resolution? Do you have any?
I think it goes back to what I talked about earlier, is helping people do more deconstruction of what's going on for them. So once they gain some empathy, self-empathy, once they understand where the other person could be coming from, that they don't engage in a mediation, or they don't engage in a challenging conversation. They don't act before they have responded internally and looked at what's going on here, and what do I need here? What's missing for me? What don't I know? Asking all the kinds of questions that would help people step back from what's going on and gain a little bit of objectivity. In the heat of the moment, most of us will say or do things that we later regret. And I've used the expression before that when we don't deal with conflict effectively, the remnants shroud the next conflict and the next. And so until we start to step back and start to look at what goes on for me, and what can I do differently, and who do I want to be in conflict, we'll just keep doing the same thing over and over again. So it really is, for me, the empathy part is gaining that self-discovery and exploration first before approaching the other person and looking at the situation together. And sometimes it may not be together. Even if somebody gains a better understanding, they may then approach the person differently in the future.
Well, for the conflict, I'm finding that the reflective listening or the empathy is very helpful, in the sense that if I do like a self-inquiry, I find it kind of lonely. It's lonely in here. But yes. if it's an inquiry with someone else, then I have that sense of connection, and then finding that resonance with someone else. If I've been looking at the science, of empathy, whereas when you come into resonance, that your mirror neurons, you're kind of shifting with someone else, and that the body releases oxytocin, which kind of is that calming kind of effect. So the empathy part of doing it with someone else is kind of like an important part from that for me.
Yeah, I think there's probably needs to do a lot more work around oxytocin and mirror neurons, because in fact, if you put two people in a mediation together, they as much might pick up the other person's angst as have empathy for. And I'm not sure that there's an automatic, I'm feeling, poor person's in trouble. They might be saying too bad for them. And so that's my sense in mediation, for instance, is spend a lot more time in pre-mediation so people are better prepared to go in and understand themselves and the other person before they go in there.
Would that be, I've been also looking at like resilience, that is like you're becoming more resilient, more centered, more grounded. And then when you go into the conflict, there's some kind of, you have more kind of a spaciousness for dealing with the conflict.
I think that's a really good point. And for me, the resilience piece often goes to what happens after conflict. So people who self-criticize and agonize after conflict are usually wearing those remnants I talked about earlier. And if you learn how to manage conflict more effectively, then you have there's a less likelihood that you are going to be not resilient at the end of it. You will have done what you need to do at the front end so that you're not agonizing at the end. I do a fair bit of coaching around people post-mediation or post any other kind of conflicts where they realize, I just shot myself in the foot by what I said or did. And they're trying to figure out it's not working anymore what I'm doing. And that's a reason why they even seek a coach.
Well, so in terms of building a culture of empathy, do you have other ideas around that? You talked about really teaching it in childhood, get a conflict coach. What else?
I think it's learning about conflict methods early on. If you could do peer coaching and it starts in schools but continues on, there's an acceptance of conflict. I think those of us who see conflict as inevitable and normal, it's how do you normalize conflict? And so again, using a conflict lens, it's how do you say, yeah, that's going to happen. So let's look at tools to do that and learn at a young age and continue on. And, that's all I can, the thing that stands out for me more is how do you start at young ages and how do you sustain that over time and how do you continue to teach it so that the school curriculums and other areas of dealing with people. And I think that, and when I say other areas of dealing with people, I realized through my own law school training and I coach lots of professional people that we often don't teach. I mean, even doctors and, we don't teach a lot around empathy and what's going on for the person. I remember as a social worker in a hospital once that a doctor was presenting on a client who had a form of arthritis who said she feels that she has flu every minute of her day. And when he came to Grand Rounds, he said, it's good that somebody would compare that because we can relate to that. We don't relate to a lot of diseases that people have, but if someone says feel like they have flu every day, we know what that feels like, and we need to get in touch with that. And I think that a lot of professionals lose track of that along the way, and that some of when you're required to deal with people who are in conflict, whatever that is, whatever form, and that's lots of them, from managers to doctors to lawyers, more training around that and more ways to figure out how to tune into what people are going through and how you might best deal with that.
So it's really about not only training for children, but we're going to need training for adults. And we have a political situation which is very conflicted. It's almost dysfunctional in the political realm. So I'm wanting to bring parties together, Democrats and Republicans, to have kind of like a mediated dialogue around what the underlying values are of the two. So we're going to need some kind of processes. We can't wait and just start teaching it for the children and then wait for 50 years for them to move through the somehow we need kind of approaches to change society, the professions, like you're saying, and having programs to teach empathy.
Well, you're talking to a Canadian, so the Democrats and Republicans, although I've watched that closely, I've certainly seen Carter in the past dealing with Israel and Palestine. And when Barack Obama first started, there were certainly conversations around people sitting down together. And I think probably more of that does need it. It is a classic. What's in it for me to sit at that table, and how can we meet each other's interests, which is the language of conflict management. How can we find out what you need and what I need, and can we come up with some mutual way of looking at what would serve us both, and with some empathy around that. When you're dealing with politics, so I don't know, I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Well, that's just something I thought maybe you had some insights, so I'm coming up. I have it scheduled in 2 weeks. I'm kind of trying to prepare for it. So, okay, Cinnie, is there any kind of final thoughts that you have around this topic of empathy and building a culture of empathy and conflict we haven't covered?
Probably a lot. You've covered a lot. One of the thought I had about, and I think it came from you initially, Edwin, was about what would be a metaphor that empathy is not. And I thought of that the other day because I recently had a wonderful experience of traveling in Tibet, and very spiritual place for me to be. And I was really grateful for the experience. And I bought a beautiful bracelet that I love in a funny little market in Lhasa. And when I started to think about what is not, I thought, you're going to hear my value of connection again. But the bracelet isn't doing up very easily. I have to really work at it. And I think that, that kind of image of a bracelet that isn't doing up, something special that isn't doing up, that to me would be a great metaphor about what empathy isn't. So those would be my final words of wisdom on it.
I better get a clarity on this. It's a bracelet that's not doing up. I'm not sure what that means. It's falling apart or... No,
it's just that the clasp doesn't do it. I have to really the clasp doing up because it quickly parts. Just the way it quickly separates. So it's how to keep it together. And I've now learned how to do that, but it was it took some work around that. And I thought that to me that it just the symbolism of it for me was something.
It's the opposite of empathy. It's like things just aren't getting connected. They keep breaking apart. They're just not coming and you're working at trying to get them to come together like that, and
it's something that could be so pretty together and so meaningful that isn't happening.
Yeah, like that metaphor, lovely metaphor you have of the crying together and the Okay, Cinnie. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts, and your website. I'll show that again here. Just is synergycoaching.com. And
Cinergy, yes, just to spell it because people often mix that word, since there's how it's used. So it's Cinergy coaching.com.
Okay, and I'm actually showing it on the screen here, so I have a screenshot.
Okay,
I showed it at the beginning too. So okay, well, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bye bye.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.